Oh there. Misinformation and disinformation has been in the forefront of people's minds during the entire COVID pandemic, but as we go into election season, it ramps up a little bit from across the political spectrum. That's why we're looking into it this week on The Public Gallery. Mis and disinformation are terms that we've heard an awful lot over the last couple of years. Misinformation is the accidental spreading of incorrect information. Disinformation is the deliberate spreading of incorrect information. And while we might have seen it quite prolifically in the last few years because of the COVID pandemic and how that makes people feel scared and small and disconnected, the fact that we've got an election on actually ramps up the amount of mis and disinformation that's out there as well, and not just from those particular quarters that were spreading theories around Italian army invasions or graphene in the vaccine or I don't know, weather control devices. You see, when you're on the go on a campaign, you've got nothing to prepare yourself for if you're out door knocking or at an event and someone asks a question. And it's impossible for anybody to know everything about policies, about talking points, about the outcomes of what it is that they're suggesting. So we do see an increase in mis and sometimes disinformation in this area. What we're going to be looking at today is how that's going, what's happening, and what the effect of that is. I'll be talking to Sam, who actually did a little bit of work around this when he was running This Quality, a local news outlet in Pornicky, Wellington. And at the same time, he's studying to be a journalist, which is a really fascinating area to look into because journalists, well, depending on who you ask, have a really fascinating role in the spread of mis and disinformation. But one of the things that needs to be made really clear about this is journalists have a code of ethics that they're supposed to work to. They have outside regulatory bodies that they need to be able to prove what it is that they're saying if it's journalism, not if it's opinion pieces. Can you see how this is already starting to be a fairly big, kind of ever changing topic? So, it's a bit of a strange one. I thought the best place to start, though, was by asking Sam, what is mis and disinformation? Does he have sort of an idea in his head exactly how it works?
So misinformation is more kind of that is misleading, that is not exactly true, and then disinformation is intentionally misleading people. So it's actually, for example, Chantal Baker saying, the vaccine's bad, for example, when it is in fact not. That is a different disinformation against, the whole rollout and undermining the whole rollout that the government has invested in. So, yeah, going back to misinformation, just to touch on that again, um, it started, throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. To my belief, I don't have any statistics to back it, but to my belief is because a lot of people got kicked out of their jobs, and what happened is they started using the internet more. They're not very knowledgeable about the internet, and they started going into right-wing conspiracy sites and kind of sites that are not official sources or not official, sources of truth, and that led them to believe into stuff that is not exactly true, which can be misleading. So yeah, there's a big difference between those two words, and it's got to be used in a appropriate manner when it comes to conversations.
When it comes to conspiracy theories, there's a really big, complicated picture of what makes a conspiracy theorist. And it really is kind of nuanced, even though they can be sometimes portrayed as not particularly bright people falling down a rabbit hole of incorrect information. But the reality is, according to research done and released in Psychological Bulletin in June this year, the nuances are really simple and really similar to what we find with voters in the lead up to elections. Essentially, it's people trying to find meaning, trying to find an explanation for what's going on, and then latching on to something that gives them validation for what they believe. Research that was done in the 2020 election for the US showcased that we kind of turn off our brains when it comes to making logical decisions around partisan politics. And all of that comes into play when it comes to an election season itself. So, why is it important that we're aware of the spread of mis and disinformation during an election season?
Yeah, so the election's very important, especially like when we have a whole load of information being spread through so many channels, and you don't know what to believe. But um, I think media literacy and sort of like an education around that is important. So like programs should kind of promote that, what you encounter online and in the media should be just taken with a grain of salt, not taken by its side, because not everything is, you know, said in that particular manner, which is non-bias, because each kind of organization will have somewhat of a spin to it, they say. um, for example, Counterspin Media. They're a very, very big fake news organization, and we all hate that the fact that they think the Christchurch shooting was a hoax when it wasn't. That's a clear example, and they use that to their advantage because of the Labour League government handled that situation, and they use that to their advantage to kind of say, okay, well, you stuffed up, and that's not right. Lives were lost, so it's not really a good topic to discuss, especially coming from a what you call a media outlet, but I call them a fake news outlet. So yeah, and that's kind of the influence these kind of rising right wing platforms have when it comes to an election. It's important to ignore what they say because they're just trying to create noise to kind of divide.
Research undertaken in 2021 showed that far right misinformation had far higher engagement rates on social media platforms than centrist or left wing information and misinformation. They're really good at capturing people's ability to be able to engage, and that's kind of worrying when it comes to mis and disinformation, but also to our news cycle. There are a number of groups currently working to spread mis and disinformation. Organizations like Voices for Freedom, for example, have put out an 11-point plan for how their members, who are meant to be secret, can sneak into meetings and start controlling the conversation that happens there, which means that suddenly you've got politicians who are on the back foot trying to answer questions that are deliberately planted to spread misinformation and disinformation and push the narratives that those particular groups want. And that's kind of scary. I asked Sam really specifically about this because it's an area that he's worked in. What has he actually seen that's been out there spreading misinformation and disinformation during the election campaign on a scale that he's actually aware of as well?
Clear example of this was, and as much as I don't agree with Christopher Luxon from the National Party, there was an individual who climbed behind a fence while he was doing a presser and interrupted Mr. Luxon, which was, I thought, disrespectful because every single political party should have a right to get their message out without being disrupted or having any sort of disruption. Um, and this individual was from Freedoms New Zealand, and just clear as day is that party Freedoms New Zealand is a complete lie. They're using the word freedom completely wrong for one, and for a second pointer I would make is that their policies won't get them into parliament. But what they try to do is they try to make a viral trend of interrupting presses and such, and it's really this is kind of what also Voices for Freedom are trying to do by attending and acting as if they're supporters, but once it gets going, once that campaign part gets going for that political party, they're trying to seek and disrupt the message, trying to create their own sort of ideology that they are the bad guys when they're just trying to get the message out. And I just think that um, it's not very nice. I think it's very disrespectful. And when people say freedom is to let other people discuss, not to interrupt.
It is kind of scary to think that there are groups out there going out of their way to disrupt the election in an effort to spread mis and disinformation, and for what ends that they are doing that. One of the incidents that Sam mentioned was involving a candidate called Karl Mokaraka. He's running for the Vision Party at the moment in one of the South Auckland electorates, and so far he's managed to interrupt Chris Hipkins during a walkthrough in the Aotearoa market. He's managed to interrupt Chris Luxon leaning over a fence during a stand-up, and he managed to sneak into David Seymour's ACT Party relaunch, wearing nothing but a fake mustache. And all of this draws attention to what he's doing, puts him in front of the camera usually, and lets him spread more mis and disinformation because his political party that he's a part of is one of 8 political parties running this year that have grown up from that field of really specific mis and disinformation that began with COVID and the vaccines. In fact, most of them are linked to at least one of what we'd call the disinformation dozen, which is what researchers have called the people who spread the most misinformation in this country around really specific topics. One of the other areas, though, that's really important to know about here is how journalism fits into this. And there are some great resources out there for people who are interested to know how misinformation and disinformation spreaders can be minimized, as well as what journalists can do, event holders can do, that kind of thing, to minimize that from happening. All you need to do is go to a place called Fact Aotearoa, just search it on Google. It stands for Fighting Against Conspiracy Theories. They've got some amazing resources there. But one of the other elements that's really important to remember here about the spread of mis and disinformation is the role our journalists play, because it's a little bit of a double edged sword. There is, on one hand, the fact that journalists have to deal with industry standards, but there are other issues that pop up as well. But I'll let Sam explain why the industry standards are important and what they mean to you as a viewer before I tell you a little bit about the other issues that can arise with them.
Official journalists and those especially like me who are learning to become a journalist and get the actual degree to kind of say, yeah, we've got that. Because a lot of people say, I spread fake news. It's like seriously, I get everything from the official channels, and that's years, like literally 4 years, coming 5 years of working at this quality, building a network through government channels, through business channels, council channels, everything, so that we can get the source straight, straight from the where it's come from, not just from some old Joe on the street that said, "Hey, did you hear about this guy who forgot to tie his shoelace and tripped over?" Um, it's that type of thing. So we learn how to identify things. We study things. We process before we even publish, and that's very important when it comes to um, creating a trustworthy source of news. So supporting fact checking um, initiatives are able, that helps us debunk false information. It helps audiences, and politicians can also cite and reference reliable sources that us journalists publish because they can rely on it. It's come straight from the source, you see. Um, but I think that regulations are the most important point to make here when it comes to journalism in general. Um, that hold organizations to account so that they actually follow the rules. And when you say you're an independent news outlet, you're free from, government rules, or you're free from the legislation. You shouldn't trust that organization, because then where are the standards? Where are all the privacy and such? Like, where is your interaction as the audience going? Has it been sold? All that kind of stuff that you agree to when you watch or listen or even browse, or even interact in real life with individuals who are not official sources.
So the negative side about journalists is, while they're thrown with so much information these days, particularly during an election, it's almost impossible to on the spot fact check and push back against any kind of mis or disinformation that's put out there. And it doesn't matter whether or not you're talking about one of those 8 political parties that have been set up to focus on that kind of disinformation, or if you're talking about one of the leaders of the main parties. Misinformation and disinformation still occurs because they're human. They can't hold all of the information in their heads. They don't know every single little policy point across the spectrum with a million people asking them questions while there are candidate events and debates and door knocking and all those kind of things going. Like, it's a big piece of mental machinery for anyone to handle it. And we saw a really great example of that last week during the TVNZ leaders debate between Chris Hipkins and Christopher Luxon. One of the things that the moderator, Jessica Mutch Mackay, did not do very often was push back on false claims. And I get it, you're on a really tight time frame, you're dealing with cameras and lights and studios and all that kind of stuff, and the aim is to get people debating. Sometimes, though, misinformation slips through. And what we actually saw afterwards was research being done by the Auckland Political Institute that had a look at who told the truth, who didn't, and both of them were sort of in the middle when it came to spreading half truths or getting half information out. But what was really interesting was the only person who actually said things that were outright wrong was Christopher Luxon. And in the heat of the moment, that doesn't necessarily mean he knows that they're wrong. It's just that afterwards they can be proven to be incorrect. And this is where misinformation and disinformation becomes really, really problematic during an election cycle. Everything is fast paced, everything is on the go, and it's really, really hard to push back sometimes. Like, really hard.
Democracy. But if we don't have that engagement, there's a huge risk of um, there's a huge risk of not being able to understand where someone or something or an organization or entity has come from. But let's just not put that toward misinformation groups like uh, New Zealand Loyal, Voices for Freedom, and such. Um, so yeah, yeah. So that's one of the risks is interruptions when it comes to speaking. So it's important to engage with the community, but the risk of, kind of, are we going to have security? Are we going to have, that's the kind of thoughts that come along when you have someone that's very popular and has a name to themselves, speaks in the public domain.
So, what can you do to find out whether or not the information you're being presented from any political party or politician is accurate? Well, this is where things get a little bit tricky. If you can find a way to independently fact check what it is that they're saying, that's a really good place to start. And it might be a case of doing a Google search and trawling through old news stories or looking at various policy points or finding out whether or not the way that they're presenting the information is unbiased, because that bias is really important as well. And when it comes to politicians at election time, that bias is probably the leading cause for the spread of misinformation. And that's a real problem because it's kind of built into the electioneering process. Because everything happens so fast, you can't necessarily stop and fact check on the spot. It makes it much more difficult to be able to hold politicians to account. And unfortunately, research shows that when it comes to how we decide which politicians to vote for, a lot of it doesn't come down to logical thinking. It comes down to our biases. It comes down to how we feel. And that's, well, that can be a really good motivator for the accidental spread of mis and disinformation. So it does become a bit of a minefield trying to work all of this out. How do you judge what's right and what's wrong, or what's correct and incorrect information, or even if it's a half truth, which kind of sounds right and makes you feel a certain way? Yeah, it is. It's a tricky topic. But Sam does have one really solid piece of advice, which I think is absolutely brilliant. Let's have a listen to it.
Seriously, chuck it in the rubbish bin. It's literally propaganda, despite what party it is. Um, and obviously, they're only going to make their pointers of, this is what we did, and this is what we want. It's not what this is. It's not what's in the present. It's always in a past tense or a future tense. And obviously, from the Nats, it's a future tense. From the Labor government, it's from the past tense, what they've already achieved. But you're never going to get what are we going to do right as the election starts. How are we going to prevent certain things from happening? Um, that's the best way I could put it. Um, uh, but I think following public awareness campaigns are the best way to go ahead with it, because in that way you get an informed sort of discussion or conversation with a professional. So if you're ever confused about something that's been promoted throughout this election, it's important to consult a professional. And what I mean by that is, as you can go and consult it with your friends if you want, but just remember, word goes around, and that word can change per person. So it's important to always follow official, follow or discuss.
The thing about something like a pamphlet is that it's clearly an advertising material, which means that it has to be covered by things like the Advertising Standards Authority. Anything that goes on television or radio has to be covered by the Broadcasting Standards Authority. There are rules in place that they have to follow, but the thing with politics is that a lot of it is about predicting the future. They can tell you stats and facts and their interpretation of it in advertising, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's 100% accurate as long as they can prove that the data points are accurate. And when it comes to what's going to happen in the future, who knows? Who knows? There might be a political party out there with a policy of making sure that we're all cryogenically frozen by the year 2050 because the world is going to be hit by a giant tsunami. And who knows if that's going to happen because it's in the future. But this is where things get really fascinating around the ethics of communication. You see, in general, a political party is going to try and get across their perspective, their viewpoint. And in theory, that shouldn't be anything ethically compromising. It can be, though. There are questions that get raised around whether or not certain communications from right wing parties, for example, are race baiting, and is that ethical? Is that a misinformation and disinformation being spread because they can turn around and say things about the Māori Health Authority, for example? It's a really tricky area. Like, it's a really tense area to work in. But when it comes to the ethics of communication, well, Sam believes that there's more at risk than just misleading a few people if we let this get out of control.
Politicians obviously have to follow ethics, right? And I haven't seen that, because Liz Gunn is trying to be a politician. It's really failing, but they should be ethically communicating to the public. And it's just the same as a news outlet. They've got to follow the laws and regulations. But what Liz Gunn's coming out and saying is, these people are going to go to hell. These people um, are the elite World Economic Forum. It's like, seriously, how crazy can you be, right? But you've got to be ethical when it comes to kind of discussing this to the public, because what I could say is, because the spread of unverified information, um, while engaging in a smear campaign, does not encourage a positive and constructive discourse when it comes to a political debate. Um, and I do think that, just a comment from kind of a university perspective, just on a final pointer here I've got as a note, um, that we should be investing, as a university should be investing in kind of research to understand, like, the motivations and origins behind disinformation campaigns, because counteracting them, as it already appears to be difficult. Um, because we've somehow approved these political parties through the electoral commission, and I get that's a freedom. You can, have a political party, but just just if you think about it for a point, um, these political parties are useless. You know, um, they're really going to have no point in the game other than to grift. That's their whole intention. Um, but when it comes to actual career politicians, we need to protect them, despite what political party they're on, what side they're on, whatnot. Because disinformation is obviously an ongoing effort that does require, like, a collective action from governments to prevent, especially from tech companies, civil society groups, or individuals themselves. um, there needs to be a balance when it comes to an election, and safeguarding against disinformation, mostly not misinformation, but mostly disinformation, because that's the killer. Um, if we can kind of safeguard against that, that will preserve the freedom of expression, and democratic discourse that we have as a collective society. And if we don't do it soon enough, and if we let these Looney Tunes get into power, we won't have uh, a discourse or even a democracy. So um, that's just my point I would like to make: is democracy is at stake here, this election. And when it comes to browsing on the internet, be very careful, think critically, and I think that's the way to go throughout this. Otherwise, democracy is just at its stake.
The last 3 to 4 years has felt like an onslaught when it comes to misinformation and disinformation. COVID, lockdowns, the pandemic, everything has felt like a lot to handle, and we're kind of getting used to a post truth landscape, which is where things like thoughts and feelings and vibes are more important than facts and information. And that can lead to even more mis and disinformation being spread, not just from those dedicated to spreading it, or from those that are doing what they can to spread it to grift people, to take their money, or to spread a narrative that can be downright dangerous. A lot of our mainstream politicians are doing this as well, and they don't even realize that they're doing it. It's impossible to fact check everything that a politician is going to say on the campaign trail in real time. And that becomes really problematic when you mix it with feelings and vibes. And we've even seen that over the last couple of weeks with the GDP announcement, where it turned out that our GDP rate was far higher than economists predicted, that the government didn't put the country into a technical recession after all. The feeling and vibes, though, was what the opposition party decided to focus on. And it doesn't matter what the facts are, it's how you feel. And you can't really dispute feelings, which is another way that misinformation and disinformation can be spread. And when it comes to trying to work out what's real and what's not, what's slightly misleading or what's completely wrong, well, there's a lot of complicating factors in that as well. Our own personal biases actually come into play a lot when we decide whether or not we want to believe a piece of information that's presented in front of us. Algorithms on social media are designed to feed us the things that we've already seen, that we've been watching and paying attention to, or that people we know who have similar thought processes and similar beliefs. That kind of stuff is fed to them directly as well, and then to us. So it kind of creates this feedback loop. But at least journalists have rules in place. There's third party regulations, there's legal stuff that they have to deal with. Online videos, they're a completely different story. There's actually no regulations in terms of electioneering for online videos, which can be really worrying because it means that a political party or a local individual can get up and say whatever they want, and there's nothing that can be done about it unless it physically aims at causing harm, in which case NetSafe and the police can get involved. That doesn't happen quite so often with our politicians these days when they're creating video content, but that doesn't mean that they can't mislead or they can't be really targeted in the comments that they're putting out there that cause you to think something or feel something. The really tricky part here is that you're being bombarded constantly with media, with pamphlets, with radio, TV interviews, politicians everywhere. There's billboards on every street corner. And we, as an audience of voters, have to be able to work out what's right, what's true. It takes a lot of effort. It can be really draining emotionally and physically, but it's something that we have to do. So good luck this election, trying to separate the wheat from the chaff, the mis and disinformation from the truth, because I think we're going to need it.